Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar about carbon footprint management organized by Preferred by Nature. We are really happy to see the interest and commitment from a wide range of companies we're working with to take action that can credibly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both within your company and in your supply chains. And we look forward to give you an overview of how the carbon footprint management approach can support this transition towards a low carbon economy in a credible and cost-effective way. My name is Ghg Emissions. I'm the Regional Director for Western Europe, and I will facilitate today's webinar. And I'm also very happy to have my colleague Justin Wren join us today. Justin holds a master's degree in environmental policy. He's one of our climate specialists and is managing our climate program, including the carbon footprint management services and trainings. After a short intro, I will hand over to Justin, who will run the presentation and answer your questions. Before we kick off, I want to mention a few practicalities. The webinar will be recorded and we will share a link to all who have registered. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but you are very welcome to raise your questions in the chat during the webinar and at the Q&A session at the end of the program. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. We have set aside quite a lot of time for question and answers, so please feel free to raise whatever questions you have during the webinar or at the end at the Q&A session. I believe that many of you already know Preferred by Nature, so I will just give a brief introduction to who we are and why we are engaged in activities to combat climate change. Preferred by Nature is a Danish-based NGO. We're engaged in activities in more than 100 countries around the world and have offices and staff in more than 30 countries. In the past 25 years, we have been supporting responsible production and sourcing of timber and agricultural products. We are working with farmers, forest operations and businesses in all tiers of the supply chains and across a wide range of commodities to establish legal and sustainable production and responsible sourcing. We focus on forest and agricultural commodities where there are opportunities for significant positive impact when it comes to environmental protection, social rights and values, as well as on greenhouse gas emissions and climate. In addition to tailored services that help companies develop and implement responsible sourcing policies, we are working with a wide range of certification schemes that plays a significant role in transitioning the forest and agricultural sectors towards more sustainable and responsible practices. All of the schemes we are offering have the ability to contribute directly or indirectly to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon footprint management services and certification program, which we will focus on today, is specifically designed to help companies understand where they have opportunities to reduce carbon emissions and to develop and implement a plan for taking robust actions and communicate credibly about what you do. So with this brief introduction, I'm happy to hand over to Justin, who will explain further about the carbon footprint management concept and the why and the hows. So over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Michael, for that warm introduction. Thank you for everyone in attendance today. So to begin this presentation, I think that involves both understanding climate change as well as carbon footprinting and how that relates to Preferred by Nature's own solution. What we'll do is we'll kind of take a high-level dive at first into what are some of the good reasons and ideas that should prompt these discussions, and where are we from a global perspective today as it relates to GHG emissions. There's oftentimes a variety of reasons and relevant reasons for that matter as to why to pursue carbon footprint management, also termed as CFM, which I will probably be using quite a bit today. I think first and foremost, it gives businesses, especially those not regulated in the various markets, an opportunity, of course, to mitigate their own reductions, whether that be throughout their value chain or as it relates to products. Why is this important? Well, of course, we're all familiar with the Paris Accord, and I think specifically it's pretty clear on the global warming aspect and where we want to be from a temperature threshold perspective. And there's an increasing push to not only stay under the 2 degrees, but more importantly, the 1.5. And this provides a variety of businesses an opportunity, of course, to do that. I think also as we think about regulation and mandates, there's also an important piece that CFM can play. Just a few weeks ago, the EU provisionally approved its EU climate law. I believe that is 55% reductions by 2030. And with that, in the upcoming months, we'll have a variety of regulations that will be the kind of the tailwind that's escorting this law as we move forward. This could involve vehicles, this could involve circular economy. We still don't have a clear sense as to what this is, but there are, of course, certain priorities. And I think with this, again, even not whether regulated or not as a business, it helps you kind of get ahead of these regulations, if you will, whether it be EU or other places, such as the United Kingdom. I think reporting and specifically sustainability frameworks also have an association to climate change as well as carbon footprint management. Many of the organizations on this call and many around the globe, of course, are pursuing reporting in terms of GRI, CDP, and also this kind of uptick in ESG reporting initiatives that we see and regulation that follows it. And all of these different frameworks oftentimes have various aspects related to carbon footprint management. And getting ahead of that piece can obviously contribute to the development of these sustainability frameworks as well. And this relates to investors, specifically in the area of ESG, taking a keen eye to see what prospective clients they have are doing the right things and whether or not investment should be doled out. And this certainly impacts then innovation in the future, not only for companies, but for industries as well, which is certainly an important aspect when you're talking about not only reducing emissions, but thinking about what are the future technologies that will help us further mitigate. And of course, increasingly from a marketing and brand perspective and sales, clients want to see this, customers as well in the marketplace. And with that, employees too. So as you go out and you recruit new employees to your organization, oftentimes climate change is playing an important part as to whether or not employees that you currently have or in the future want to contribute to your business and play a successful role based on whether or not and what you're doing from a sustainability perspective. And I think generally speaking, when you dive into a carbon footprint management plan, not only are you getting a sense of what your emissions are, of course, but also what types of materials you are using throughout the supply chain and in terms of your collaboration with suppliers and what type of synergies we can find in this respect to mitigate climate impacts in the future. It broadens your expertise. Oftentimes clients come to us and say, well, this is very challenging and we don't have the resources, and we surely are there to help you. But at the same time, like I often tell my daughter, if something's challenging, the best way to sometimes do it is to dive right in and take on the challenge head on. And oftentimes you'll find that it isn't so bad, especially as it relates to GHG accounting and reporting. And two, what we see now, especially with the sustainable development goals and whatnot and other initiatives, there is an increasing need and desire and aspiration to incorporate social elements into everything you do around sustainability, and even specifically with climate change and GHG reductions. And especially when we talk about looking through the supply chain, oftentimes when you start uncovering where emissions are, what types of materials you're using, what type of materials can be replaced, oftentimes you can start to kind of turn over the stones and find other areas where you can make a positive social impact as well. So from a global perspective, this slide that you see on the screen demonstrates where we are from a GHG emission perspective around the world. As you can see, we still continue to have an uptick. As recently as 2009, we're at about 57 gigatons or billion tons of GHG emissions that we're emitting as a result of human activities. This slide, of course, includes not only CO2, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and other fluorinated gases. It also includes land use change. And I will draw a caveat around land use change emissions that oftentimes they're difficult to measure and there is quite variance. But regardless of that, needless to say, you can see the continuous uptick, even with things like the Paris Accord and regulation being passed down. We are still, the trajectory is still in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Now, if we look specifically at CO2, without land use change and some of the other greenhouse gases, it's a similar story. As you may probably know, there has been a plateau in recent years, at least through 2019, but certainly not a downward trajectory that we would like to see. So what does this all mean? It means that from anthropogenic activities, human activities, we still are well above 50 billion tons of carbon per year as a result of our activities. We have to keep in mind, of course, that land use change, there is uncertainty around there, and that typically involves anywhere between 3 and 5 billion tons of that total. But I think there is recognition around this, and there are standards now being built and probably will be in place end of this year, early next year, to allow us to get a better handle of how to not only account for our emissions as it relates to land use change, but how also to report it and think about it in the future. As you can see on the picture to the right on this screen, this is a representation of total GHG emissions by sector and use. Those emissions associated with energy use play the most significant role. I think if you add this up, we're looking at somewhere between 70 and 75% of all emissions are stemming from energy use. At the same time, this provides, of course, an opportunity for reductions. I think in a very kind of eye-opening fact that I just read about is that during 2020, with COVID in place, the global emissions went down by about 7%. And we know the reasons for that. And 7% is a good number, albeit regardless of whether or not we're expecting and already seeing rebound in 2021. But to put this in perspective, the UNFCCC has told us that from 2020 to 2030, in order to accomplish our goals for, let's say, net zero by 2050, we should actually be reducing by 7.6% CO2, as opposed to the 7% that we realized last year. So to put that in perspective, we have all been working from home, we haven't been traveling, and even with all that being said, we are still slightly below the expectations of where we should be over the decade of 2020 to 2030. So what I'll do now is I'll start to kind of peel back the onion a little bit and get more specifically into the preferred by nature CFM solution and explain more as to why we're having this presentation and why we're excited about the program moving forward. We initially launched our standard and CFM service back in 2013, well before I was a part of Preferred by Nature. But I think over the last few years, and well, I know a lot of changes have taken place, especially in recent years with an increased interest in things like offsetting, of course, regulation, the introduction and implementation and rollouts of the Paris Accord. And with all these things in mind, we've tried to reconsider what our program, where it is and where it should be in the future. What we have today is we still have a comprehensive standard that we've built that is in place for companies who want to work with us and get verified against a robust and strong standard. This includes best practices and quite a bit of clarity and guidance as how to approach GHG emissions, whether it's through your value chain or as it relates to products or services. And again, we still offer this credible third-party verification in accordance with our standard, as well as the use of, for instance, our own labels if you want to further promote what you're doing, whether it be on your website or on products and so on and so forth. But what we've done now is based on market insights and feedback from clients, we have an increased emphasis and focus on support and guidance. What we've seen oftentimes is, especially for depending on the type of business, this can be an overwhelming challenge, trying to manage your emissions, trying to report on your emissions, and that's been significant feedback that we've seen. So moving forward, we've tried to create a plan where we continue to maintain verification if that's of interest to you, but also try and facilitate and support you along the CFM journey in a much more thorough and expansive way. And with that, we've also adapted our service portfolio and grown our service portfolio, which we'll get into shortly, in order to, again, accommodate your own initiatives, your own paths as you move forward. And we are also more open and willingness, if you will, for one-off opportunities and ideas. The environment is changing very quickly in terms of CFM. Oftentimes we get requests, atypical requests, if you will, for clients that want to do certain things at the farm level or the agricultural level that may not necessarily fall into certain areas. So we certainly now are looking at those, reviewing them with clients, and are certainly open to the prospect, if it makes sense, to also test and even pilot situations that might seem atypical or not normal from a CFM perspective, at least traditionally. Here's an overview of our different service options. I'll be getting into these more in detail as we move along, but essentially we still have verification of your corporate product or even event footprints in place today, which means you adhere to our standard, you compile the data, you report the data, and then we perform an audit, or an assessment or audit against your carbon footprint management plan. We've evolved this a step further to include something now called tailored evaluations. And this goes back to my last remark on the previous slide about understanding that no two customers are the same, and there could be situations where a customer would like to move forward with verification without necessarily adhering to our standard and crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. And with this, we create a framework and structure whereby we're able to verify based on your own needs and initiatives within your business. The next point, capacity building and advisory. This is where the support function comes out. We have a variety of different types of functions in these areas to help you along the way, moving towards assessment or audit, but also beyond as you progress on your CFM journey. This includes training, but it also includes more aspects now related to ongoing support and whatnot. And finally, there are some advanced support options which we've introduced. It's fairly new, but these involve things like helping you to understand how to fill out questionnaires that you may receive from your clients. They may involve helping you fill out portions of your sustainability frameworks if for instance, GRE or CDP are on your radar. So I think it's important to note that we work with a range of industries and client types, just not those that are more related to our own DNA as preferred by nature. And up on the screen, you can see some of the different industries and client types we have been working with more extensively and intensively over the past year or so as we've begun to revisit, restart, and ramp up our new CFM program. And I won't spend too much on this slide, but if you have any questions at the next interval, please ask. But again, I think the main takeaway is we are trying to be as industry and business agnostic as possible moving forward. And I think we have now the tools and systems and expertise in place to accommodate a variety of different clients and backgrounds.
There are a few questions already, Justin. I'm not sure if you can answer all of them, but you had a slide 11 with some graphics where it was asked, what were the transport emissions for shipping? I'm not sure you can answer that specifically.
Let me go back. Which slide was it, Michael?
Slide 11, the one where you have the graphics on emissions.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah, that one.
Unfortunately, this one doesn't have the shipping. I know Our World in Data has another slide where it breaks down even further into industry type. So we can certainly provide you with the link after that and share that with you.
Right. Then there was a question in the last slide you had regarding FSC certified paper, whether they're 100% recycled mixed. Will you now connect climate footprints of paper as part of the grading? FSC mix high and low CO2 emissions. I think I could just say general, of course, FSC is in charge of their system and standards, so it's up to them. But I don't know, Justin, if you have any additional comments with regards to how some of these schemes are adopting carbon footprint into their standards. Are you able to talk about that?
From an FSC perspective, maybe not entirely, but if you are, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, if there are the different grades now, and I mean, we can certainly, I mean, that should be represented in the carbon footprint management plan, and we can certainly collaborate with you to understand what those, at least what those emissions are to a certain extent. I think an important thing to note with any of this is the aspect of methodology and how to go about calculating. From an FSC standpoint, if the methodology is there and you have the emissions in place, of course, that would translate into the CFM directly from a carbon footprint standpoint. If the methodologies are not in place in terms of calculations, then we would have to take a look at that. But there are certainly resources out there to calculate that. I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly.
Yeah, I think that's a general consideration. We can't answer exactly what FSC is going to do. I think that's something for FSC to answer. So, and then there are some comments regarding other certification schemes, and so I think we'll save that to later. So I think, Justin, if you continue, then I'll try to sort out the questions and we bring it up later.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So now we'll take a little bit more of a deep dive into our own preferred by nature CFM standard. Essentially, based on the standard now we're talking about, you have three verification scopes that you could pursue, one being corporate, another being products or services. So now we're thinking about things like life cycle stages and an LCA and areas like that. And we have a newly introduced area called events. So you do have the opportunity as well, if you'd like to pursue neutrality of events such as conferences, meetings, festivals, whatnot. We do have criteria in place in the standard to help you towards verification of that area. Now, typically, we have three kind of different ways of thinking about how to manage and what you want to focus on in terms of your different verification scopes. You, of course, have measuring. Oftentimes, this is the first stage that clients take, especially if they haven't performed carbon footprint management previously. And this is basically getting a hold of where your emissions are as it relates to whatever the scope it is that we're speaking about. Of course, reductions is another aspect. This typically happens for first-time customers in year 2. We don't necessarily require reductions in the first year. There's enough to bite off as you're getting a handle on the standard and the calculations behind it and data collection and whatnot. But there are year 2, there isn't the expectation that you will be reducing, and we have thresholds within the standard that we would like you to adhere to. And then there's, of course, carbon neutrality. It is an option, and it is not a requirement, but after you have reduced, then you, of course, have the option to buy and purchase and retire carbon credits moving forward. And if you buy sufficient number of credits, then, of course, you have the opportunity to claim and promote yourself as carbon neutral. I will say there is one exception to this. We do allow carbon neutrality to take place in the first year of the program, but the first year only. So you can essentially measure and then purchase and retire sufficient carbon credits to claim neutrality. But moving ahead in years 2 and beyond, you will have to reduce first and meet those requirements before moving towards neutrality, if that is something you would like to do. Here are the different sections of our standard. They are very similar to what we've had over the last 5 or 6 years. Essentially, you begin with creating a climate policy, assigning responsibilities of those within your organization who can manage CFM, as well as demonstrate how you're going to monitor and manage this over the long run. From there, you move into boundaries and scope. Here you've identified whether or not you want to pursue corporate or product or an event footprints. We have guidance within the standard now that demonstrates what should be included, how to develop these boundaries, and what should be included in, as it relates to the addition, the respective emission scopes 1, 2, and 3, and of course, identifying and implementing your base year, whatever that might be. Base year being where now you have enough information across the different scopes to state that this is our starting point moving forward. We have requirements as well as guidance on data collection and calculations. So what emission sources, what should I include within my footprints, whether that be from a corporate standpoint and on-site emissions or emissions throughout the supply chain. These are included and also specified quite clearly in terms of what needs to be included, how to go about calculating your emissions, what methods are appropriate, and also what types of data should be focused on, whether it be primary data or secondary data from external publications, as well as the use of emission factors to help you take that data, that activity data, and understand what your emissions are. I think one of the most important parts of the standard is the footprint management plan. So this is not only where you bring everything you've done together, but you also clearly demonstrate what your reduction targets are now and into the future. You outline your plans and the activities that you're taking to reduce emissions, as well as how you're going to demonstrate and evaluate your progress moving forward. And then taking this information, at least aspects of it, and then reporting it publicly. And oftentimes we see clients taking what they've done in the footprint management plan, redacting it to a certain point, and then making this the publication or integrating what they've done into other sustainability reports that they may already have in place. And finally, there's the claims section. This is where you try to be as transparent about what you've done as possible in order to make claims. And what I mean by that is if you make the claim, for instance, that you are reducing, you also want to have somewhere, whether it be on your website or elsewhere, where you've demonstrated exactly what's been included in your emissions plan, how you've gone about creating it, so that if clients kind of want to ensure or understand more specifically what reductions mean, they can understand that based on this information. And we also have at this point some guidance and criteria around our own preferred by nature labels that you can use, again, whether you're pursuing corporate, product, service, or even event footprints. Have been enhancements to the standard as opposed to what we had previously in our version 1. Our version 2, which is more or less done, will be formally published probably in the next couple of weeks, but for all intents and purposes, it is already functional and being used by clients. What we've tried to do in the new standard is be more crystal clear on what emission sources you should include for corporate and product footprints, meaning what are the specific emission sources within scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 that need to be included, and which of those are in fact optional. As well as scope 2, there's an increasing focus on this. So we're talking about energy use and consumption. There's guidance on how to manage this, along with criteria, how to go about the calculations, what data you should be looking for in order to make this as succinct and aligned with globally recognized standards as much as possible. If event criteria is your flavor, we have information on this, like I already mentioned, and then along with reduction obligations too, which appear in the annex as well as the body of the standard in terms of how many emissions annually you should reduce. We also have some insetting insights. For those of you who are unfamiliar with insetting, it is an emerging term. The way I like to describe it to people is that think of offsetting only within your own value chain or sphere of focus, as opposed to purchasing carbon credits or being involved with projects that fall outside of your value chain in, for instance, other countries. So insetting takes a similar approach to offsetting, but within your sphere of influence. And finally, as I mentioned, new labels, if there is interest for using the preferred by nature logo, if you will. This is a busy slide. There's no need to try and dissect it right now, but essentially, this is an example of what you can find in the annex. What you see on the left-hand side of the screen is probably something many people on this call have seen in the past, kind of this delineation of scope 1 versus scope 2 versus scope 3 emissions, and specifically within the different scopes, what are the emission sources that you should be looking at and including in your footprint. What we've done now is we've translated all of this specific information into a helpful guide in the back of the standard, which outlines what is required as it relates to the different scopes and what is optional. And we've done something similar for products and services and the associated life cycle stages. We've taken the learnings from the globally recognized standards and outlined what should be required if you're pursuing cradle to gate, if you're pursuing cradle to grave, and delineating what that means and how that relates to your footprint. And I always like to tell people who especially are new to carbon footprint, if you look at the image to the top left on your screen, you know, how does product relate to your corporate footprint? And I think this image does a good job of representing that. But essentially what you can think of is if you were to take every single type of product or service that you have in your portfolio that you are selling as an intermediate product, or if you're selling as a final product, if you were to take all of those and perform a full life cycle assessment with a focus on GHG emissions, what you would have more or less is your corporate footprint, minus a few areas and caveats such as things like employee commuting, R&D work and such. Those might fall out, but you would have more or less a good understanding and you would come close to approximating all of your corporate emissions if you were to do all of your products. Oftentimes clients come to us, especially first-time clients embarking upon this journey for the first time, and say, well, where do we start? This is complicated. We've tried it in the past. We weren't able to make it happen for a variety of reasons. And I can't say, every single customer is unique, and they take on embarking upon CFM in a different way. But what I try to do is categorize CFM into kind of three elements on this screen in terms of what to at least think about as you're starting off, as you're getting more into the work-related activities, and then as you're moving into kind of results and the compilation of all your information. And I think oftentimes a good place to begin when you're starting off is to understand the purpose. And that's very specific to your business. It could be that a downstream client is requiring this of you. It could be that you just want to do good. It could be there could be marketing and branding reasons as to why you want to pursue CFM, but it's always good to understand what those reasons are, especially if you want to kind of take the next step and start to integrate what you're doing in the overall business and overall business strategy so that you can have I think a reasonable and tangible conversation that can align with other needs of the business. Training is an area that we provide to most clients. We do have a training program set up, which we will get into, to help you kind of go down the road and understand CFM in more detail, as well as our standard. And I think, of course, you need to understand what you want to do. Do you want to pursue corporate or product or a combination of both? And we can work with you to understand what best accommodates your needs, but oftentimes performing mapping type of exercises to understand where are you from a supply chain perspective if you're thinking about corporate, where you are from a life cycle stage perspective if you're thinking about product, can help you gauge this. And oftentimes we see different approaches, but clients may, for instance, focus on products based on revenue. They may focus on products to begin with because of for procurement reasons and the amount of material that is being brought into the business, and kind of rank that to determine what products to focus on based on the amount of material use and so on and so forth. Then you start to move kind of into what I would classify as the work-related aspects of CFM. And this is where you start to get into more of the technical aspects of, if you will. Well, how do we collect data? Should we talk to our suppliers? Should we use invoices, internal systems that we have around resource management? We've also seen clients put together surveys, internal surveys, to help them understand emissions from their employees and what's going on from that angle. So there's a variety of ways to kind of tackle how do we collect data. You also want resources in place. So you've thought about resources, but identifying the specific resources in the organization that can help you understand what your energy use is, to understand what transportation is from a company perspective. For instance, supply chain management professionals might be able to also facilitate different areas. So it's understanding who are the responsible parties that can help you not only collect, but also calculate this data in a thorough way. Here as well, at least as it relates to our program, we have clients then beginning more of the ongoing support perspective, where they come up to us with questions and we try and provide feedback and areas to move forward so that they can kind of integrate this as they're going, especially if they are finding that there are obstacles or roadblocks. So we try and facilitate this as much as possible to help you have a relatively smooth plan and course of action as you get into the activities area. And also, what tools are we going to use to not only collect the data, but also calculate the data? And we have some information that we'll share with you shortly about how to go about and begin this journey, but you certainly should think about how to create documents, create databases, create inventories that make the most sense to your business. And that's typically what we see clients do. They take the templates that we provide them and they adapt them depending on what their needs are. So then you move into results. Now you're thinking about how do we take this information and put it together? We have a carbon footprint management template, which certainly can guide you with this. Again, this is where we also see clients now who have kind of gained experience. They've taken the tools and templates that we provided and they start to customize them as they become more comfortable with the CFM process. This is also a good place to start looking at now, what gaps do we have in terms of our emissions across the value chain or in the product? What are the assumptions that we've made? Is there uncertainty around those assumptions that we made? And you're not necessarily having to solve and answer all of these gaps or assumptions, but you should certainly take note and figure out what is the plan that I need in place in future years to mitigate this kind of uncertainty as much as possible as I move along. And what I've done, does it align with stakeholder expectations, for instance, both internally and externally? And this is a good time also to review on the things that you've done previously and to figure out, have I demonstrated what I want to demonstrate based on the reasons I got started for this at the beginning. Now, a part of the results section, and which will be probably an area to focus more on, especially as you move into years 2, 3, and beyond, is, well, now how do I reduce my emissions? How do I create a reduction plan that is reasonable, that makes sense, that aligns with the time horizons that I care about? And I think there's a multitude of different considerations that you need to take in account depending on your business. One of which is whether or not, if I have ideas for reductions, is it actionable or is it not actionable? Does the technologies exist out there today that would allow me to do this, or do I know, are those technologies kind of coming down the pipeline in 5 or 6 years? And this is a good way to also start to thinking about, how do I want to classify my reductions over the short term, let's say a few years, midterm, 5 years or more, and then longer term as we move into 2030 and 2035. Also related to feasibility and audit is an important aspect, the financials. Oftentimes clients will have, certain thresholds in place within the business to determine whether or not they should move forward with projects. This can be done through return on investment. This can be done based on NPV analyses and so on and so forth. These are very powerful tools, and I would highly recommend it, especially for larger projects. If you're considering to get buy-in and move forward with reductions, to take a look at the different financial methods out there to gain buy-in and get those investments going. And especially, for instance, as it relates to NPV analysis, if you're determining between status quo or doing something to reduce emissions, make sure to start thinking about those environmental benefits. It's an important aspect. Subsidies, tax breaks, the types of fuel or non-fuel that I will be using thereafter. And by including these kind of other financial figures in your NPV analysis, what you'll find oftentimes is over a 5 or 10-year horizon, these more sustainability focused, helpful solutions start to make a lot more sense to the business. Of course, think about regulation. Is there something that's coming in the pipeline that I will be expected to adhere to and align with? And how does that relate to the short, medium, and long term? Also, if you are doing other sustainability reporting, such as materiality assessments for GRI, or you have risk management teams approach, increasingly these areas are being now integrated with CFM as a way to identify, for instance, what should my priorities be? What products should I focus on? What operations or facilities should I focus on to reduce? And there can be a lot of interesting learnings that come through that based on other internal teams already working on these types of areas. So now that you've kind of gone through what I would consider very much related to a risk-based management approach within the organization to determine how should we reduce moving forward, then it's about creating the plans and the activities. And there's a variety of ways to do that. You see some of them on the right hand of the screen. I think maintenance activities are always an interesting one. Some of the larger companies really have a strong focus on this. What are the things that we can do now within the organization to reduce? Are there things that we can do, programs that we can implement with people on the floor, at the facilities, at the manufacturing facilities, whatever it might be, that can help us along this journey? Can we combine batches or materials that we have? How can we streamline processes? How can we section off different areas of the facility in terms of lighting, in terms of refrigeration? And these things might seem small, but there's a lot of focus on this because it's something that isn't so cost intensive, but can make a big difference. And then as we think about things like circular economy, which looks like, it is certainly gaining momentum. You start thinking about eco-design for products, and not only the products, but packaging. How do I create pallets that maximize the different loads that I have that are being sent out? Can I remanufacture parts that I have already introduced into the market? Can I reuse the products themselves? So now these type of aspects related to circular economy and Ellen MacArthur Foundation is what we're talking about here. I think also in terms of, do I want to move to renewable energy? Do I want to introduce my own renewable energy on site? Are areas certainly that clients think about over time. These are longer term projects, but certainly can make a significant difference. There's other quicker hits, I would say, in terms of things like smart devices that are out there to make sure that lighting turns off, if you will, when people are out of the facility or out of the office. And also kind of revisiting your procurement decisions and the practices that you have in place for that, and determining, do I have the right suppliers in place, and am I purchasing the right materials in order to accommodate the reduction expectations and goals that I have moving forward? And there are many others, but this is just a short snapshot of some of the opportunities that you may have to reduce and create a reduction plan in the future. I think one of the important differentiators of our standard is we've done a lot of the work for you in terms of consolidating the material that is available in a lot of the different globally recognized standards. We have gone through all the standards you've seen on your screen in great detail. There's other standards and methods and initiatives such as science-based targets that we've reviewed, maybe not as in depth, but to understand what is important to include in the standard and what maybe can be left out. And some CFM providers do have standards. The robustness of those varies greatly. Others recommend that you simply jump into these standards yourself or bring in a consultant to do it for you. The good news is I think we've done a great job of, in a very comprehensive way, taking all of the vital elements of these standards and transposing them into a single resource for you to use. And a lot of these standards have also been built on or built in lockstep with some of the ISOs. So you should feel a reasonable level of confidence if ISO is more of what you're thinking about, that the information in the standard is based and aligns with a lot of the different ISO CFMs out there, because these standards that you see on the screen themselves already align with these ISOs to a great extent. So to kind of wrap this up, the CFM standard in itself, based on globally recognized standards, single robust resource for you to use, significantly more guidance than we had in the past. There is certainly there is a stronger emphasis on reductions and creating targets that make sense. And the standard outlines that, I think, fairly clearly. If neutrality is more your speed, there is an option for that if you so choose. But I think the important thing is you don't have to be perfect at the beginning. We realize this is a challenge and this is a journey, and progress is as important as the results themselves in many ways. Along with that, there is the communications aspect, if you so choose to jump on that wagon. We do have the labels, the updated labels, as you can see on the screen to the right. These work for both off and on product labels. So whether it be on the website or if you're pursuing products, you can attach them here as well. But I think the important thing is, based on the way that we've structured the claims, the claim process, and the evidence supporting the claims, you can feel rest assured that when you share this with your stakeholders, there is credibility that stands behind the labels and claims that you use, and that this information can be evidenced based on your different media streams, or however you decide to publish the information. So I'll take a short pause there, Michael, and see if there's any questions before I continue.
And yes, there are, Justin. There's one very specific that's about, do you apply the product environmental footprint methodology created by EU when calculating the emissions from a product?
I am familiar with that. We did investigate that. We actually had elements of that in the previous standard. We have not gone through all of that in great detail. I would say looking at, I think if we're referring to the PEPs and organizational environmental footprints, a lot of that has been built on kind of GHG protocol and BSI and others. So there are certainly elements in there. In this standard, our recommendation is that if you are pursuing one of the specific product lines that fall under this this EU initiative, you should certainly take a look at it to see if there's any additional inclusions that might be needed, and we can help you do that as well. But I wouldn't say that it would have been, I think, too intensive and detailed had we gone in and really dissected all of the different initiatives from that perspective in the standard. So we did not do that.
Good. I hope that answered the question. Otherwise, you're welcome to raise further questions related to that. Then there are some questions and also comments regarding offsetting and insetting. And of course, offsetting is kind of a controversial part of managing and reducing carbon emissions. And the question is, carbon offsetting is becoming very controversial, just shifting the damage, not necessarily reducing emissions. So there's a challenge here. How can we redirect the flood of CO2 offsetting funds to massive, often questionable, damaging tree planting to biodiversity offsetting? So I think that's a question generally about how do we see offsetting and play a role here, and what do we consider credible offsetting projects?
Well, I think to answer the first point, we do have some offsetting slides towards the end, so we'll tackle this a bit more. I think well, I shouldn't say we. I should say myself personally, and probably in the camp that is more critical of offsets because of the reliance that there is now on offsetting. And to that point, and this is why we have so much focus on reductions. Offsetting itself is not a solution to get us to 1.5 degree thresholds in 2030 or 2050, I should say. And in fact, there are asymptotes that you're going to be experiencing with offsetting, especially if we're talking about more nature-based solutions in terms of the amounts of absorption and sequestration, whether that be on land or the sea, that's these types of solutions can provide. And essentially, the Earth only has so much bandwidth to take in, and it will not get us to that point. And along with that, I think another point that's becoming more controversial, again, as it relates to the co-benefits and the social aspects, and if there's an over-reliance in these areas, what does that mean for indigenous people, for developing countries, especially that rely on agriculture or forestry as well. So I think the key here is to make sure that the reductions are in place. First, that is vital to not over rely on offsetting. That is kind of a next step. And to really focus on the reductions. And I'm not alone in this camp. If you even look at the science-based targets, which is growing in momentum right now, and there's a lot of larger organizations at least buying into this in combination with CDP and WRI and others, they take a similar stance. They certainly recognize that if this is an area of interest for you, then you should consider pursuing it. But there's also a lot of caveats around the areas that I just mentioned, and it certainly shouldn't be a crux, or there shouldn't certainly be an over-reliance on this, because we quite simply won't meet our goals moving forward. There's just too much uncertainty around this. And in terms of quality, we go through this, I think, a little bit in the final slides, but I will say that it seems like I would say the more reputable, well-known carbon offset project schemes out there now are recognizing this as well, the different caveats, and hence why we're seeing not only measurements around CO2 is an important factor, but also the social elements as well, and integrating those more along with biodiversity into the package before these carbon credits are signed off of. So that was a long-winded answer.
Yeah, so you confirm, Justin, that we see this definitely as a potential controversial move, and that thorough consideration needs to be applied when using offsetting. I think I don't want to say controversial. I just think that there's an over-reliance on it, and you need to understand that without reductions, what we're trying to accomplish globally is not going to happen. Based on that. Then there's also a question regarding insetting. I'm not sure exactly, the comment on slide 20 or 21 where you talk about insetting, and a concern that our approach would actually allow for greenwashing, because we would accept insetting that that is already used by fossil fuel oil companies that also invest in renewable energy. So maybe can you clarify a little bit, how do we work with insetting and what role it can play, and whether there's a risk of greenwashing here?
Well, I wouldn't be so concerned about the greenwashing when working with insetting, because the insetting standards and guidance out there, the recognized ones, and it's still emerging, more or less aligned with all the requirements of things like BCS, gold standard, Plan Vivo, so on and so forth. So there is an extremely strict rules and requirements around insetting, just as you would have with offsetting. The only difference again being is insetting should be happening within your sphere of influence within the value chain. Now, I suppose there could be some questioning about sphere of influence and what does that mean, but I think I hope that we will have more clarity around this. But you need to evidence and prove that if you are going to take insetting as a reduction, that you have built it upon these other recognized carbon offset scheme standards that I spoke of, and that there is a direct connection to, for instance, your upstream scope 3 emissions. For example, that you are in fact procuring from a certain farm or from a certain forest through the supply chain. So I think that evidence needs to happen.
Great, thanks, Justin. I think these were the questions we have so far.
Okay.
So thank you for the questions. Please raise further if you have any. We'll be happy to answer. But Justin, you can just continue, I think.
Yep. So relating to verification, as I mentioned earlier, is the tailored evaluation option. Again, this service option that we now provide relates to helping you verify initiatives within your organization or projects that perhaps relate to a portion of the supply chain or a specific facility or elements of a product, without having to go kind of the full way using the CFM standard. And typically these types of evaluations, we work closely with you at the beginning to understand what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to verify, and then also identifying, are there elements of our own standard or other standards or sector guidance out there that should be incorporated into this type of verification, so that you can communicate something that is thorough and well-founded based on science and information out there. Tailored evaluations could be one-time or reoccurring. It really doesn't matter, and there is a verification certificate issued at the end. However, I will say with tailored evaluations, unfortunately, the use of our labels is not allowed based on its limited focus as it relates to CFM. So we're not talking about all 6 steps or sections of the standard. Typically, we're only talking about maybe 1 or 2 sections in particular that you want to focus on, such as calculations, as an example, and results. Some examples of different types of tailored evaluations that we've been involved with, for instance, verifying the scope 1 and 2 emission results for certain manufacturing facilities for clients. We've also looked at the life cycle of coffee and the emissions related to that, to make sure the information aligned not only with aligned with other studies that have been done out there in terms of coffee production throughout the life cycle. Also software and tools. Oftentimes we see clients increasingly now wanting to focus on maybe a specific emission source or a specific area of the life cycle, and have developed software tools to allow their customers to calculate this information. And what we can do is we would come in and review these tools or software that's been created to see to understand the level of accuracy that these tools produce from an output perspective, and whether or not they are thinking about the kind of the different rules and whatnot around the different emission scopes that they should be thinking about. So it really depends. I think it's a very flexible option. It's actually quite interesting for a lot of companies so far that we've seen, but it really is an option for you to work together with us to get verification on maybe a specific element that you would like to focus on. Okay, so I'll just pause there again, see if there's anything else before I kind of move in towards the latter half of this in winding the webinar up, Michael.
There is one specific question related to publishing in paper, whether we recommend to use FSC recycled or mixed material, where the climate footprint of FSC recycled can be significantly higher. I don't know if you have a comment to that, Justin.
Unfortunately, I don't. Should have come more prepared for the FSC stuff, but yeah. I don't know. Is there something you'd like to share on that, Michael?
No, I don't know the calculations of this, and it's a relevant question there. But I think in terms of carbon footprint management, of course, these are things to consider when making your decisions regarding your sourcing, so that you can control your carbon footprint, right, in the supply chain and the products you're using. So if there's a significant difference, of course, relevant and important to consider.
I will say that we have systems in place, not specific to FSC or anything like this, but I mean, if you do have the calculations or you're interested to kind of get an idea about, you know, what mixed versus recycling and whatever might be, you know, there is more average data out there that's available that we could help you locate and consider, especially if this is an area that you're considering, but you would need to have as much information as possible about the processes that are behind that paper, the types of materials that are going into that paper. But if we have this information, then we could at least probably come to some type of number that could be used for comparison purposes.
Yeah, there are no further questions at this point, so please go ahead, Justin.
So with that being said, we'll get a little bit into kind of the support functions that I talked about earlier at the beginning of the presentation and what we can offer. Typically, we have our standard support, which most clients have access to, and it is available to for clients. This includes helping them kind of navigate this large pool of databases that are out there to identify data, to collect data. And oftentimes this relates to emission factors. If you've never gone through these databases in the past, they can be a bit overwhelming. We've worked quite intimately with a lot of them. So to help you understand what these are, how to use them, and where the information can be found is a service that we provide with typically normal supports. We also have created a variety of templates and tools for you to use, namely a CFM template, which clients will use throughout the course of their verification journey to make sure that they're kind of checking all the boxes, if you will, around CFM from beginning to end, in order to ensure that they're prepared as much as possible for the assessments or the audits, and along with the calculation tools that can be used. There is no one calculation tool that works for everyone. We've learned that, and there's no way we can create that, but we certainly have tools in place to get you started in the right direction, and then you can adapt as needed. And then supplier template forms. This has been an increasingly popular request recently, so we have some supplier template forms that you can share with your suppliers when you're going through this data collection process to understand how many materials that I bring in, what are those materials composed of, what are the emissions of those materials if they exist, so on and so forth. And as we take the next step in terms of support services, of course, there is the training that we provide. And this is a popular add-on, if you will, as a part of the program. Typically, for about a half a day, we'll get together with you. We'll go through everything CFM, probably in more detail than you would have ever you could have ever imagined previously that you would go through, understanding what CFM is, understanding specifically in more detail what the requirements of the standard are, how to go about data collection, calculation principles. There are also exercises in place to kind of help you get up to speed as you prepare for the development of your carbon footprint management plan, and also, again, helping to identify and locate the resources out there that might be valuable to your specific business or product. And increasingly now what we're seeing is more sector guidance being developed across a number of global initiatives, which are really starting to spell out the different requirements that a specific industry or business should consider based on what it is that they want to focus on. And along with that, if you would like, there can be ongoing support even when pursuing verification, meaning we can continue to answer questions around the standard with you on a regular basis, provide feedback on what you're doing and some guidance in terms of perhaps you're having struggles and how to overcome these different obstacles, and also helping to facilitate, after you've tried, obviously, to locate, for instance, hard to find emissions data for specific elements, whether it relates to your supply chain or products. These are also the types of tools and services that are available when we talk about ongoing support and collaboration with you. And kind of one step further removed from that, we have seen some inquiries and requests to also help fill out things like questionnaires from downstream clients, from different organizations where perhaps the business itself wants to pursue a sustainability ranking initiative and things like this. Also help with actually understanding some other standards out there in sustainability frameworks. So at least as it relates to climate change and GHG emissions, we do have some experience here and could help you kind of navigate this specific area if needed. Another area which we've done a little bit of, but there is certainly a need, is to actually help kind of go more in depth into the reduction plan and developing a plan to help you realize reductions over the long term. This would require, of course, understanding what your emissions are, understanding sector guidance, understanding the needs of the business. I will say this is an option, however, with the caveat that depending on how far we would go in this area, this could prohibit us from providing kind of this idea of independent third-party verification. So we try and toe this line carefully and communicate if and at what point we would potentially extend over this line and no longer be able to provide verification to you. And I think finally, offset projects. We have some pilots in place right now working with clients where with a variety of requests, helping to understand or calculate different offsetting, helping to understand the requirements for different offsetting initiatives, whether or not they are aligned with kind of the big names such as Gold Standard or Verra, or whether they are standalone opportunities that clients would like to pursue, but helping them to understand what are the requirements around kind of gauging and developing these products, what are the considerations, so on and so forth, without actually acting as a validator or verifier, which we currently do not do. So things related to offset projects of also evaluation identification could be areas that we could also collaborate with you on depending on your needs. So with that, we'll get into carbon offsets and kind of the engagement process before we come to a conclusion here. So we have included a couple of slides on carbon offsets because it is a popular point of conversation and topic which clients want to talk about. I think before I get into that, I just want to make it clear that increasingly as well, there is a focus on this idea of the mitigation hierarchy that is out there. We see this recognition by a number of large NGOs, and the focus on the mitigation hierarchy is specifically to remind businesses and clients where the focus should be at the beginning, in terms of going through CFM and reductions, and where offsets relate into the hierarchy. And first and foremost, whenever you're thinking about CFM and ways to avoid or reduce emissions, you should think about avoidance first. What actions can I take today that would avoid emissions in the first place, whether you're opening up a new facility, whatever it might be. How do you nip emissions in the bud at the beginning to begin with, before they even emit in the first place? And the emissions hierarchy focuses on avoiding emissions as much as possible at the beginning. Then you kind of move into the reduction standpoint, which is now understanding what maintenance activities can I do, how do I increase efficiency from a manufacturing process, from an energy use perspective to reduce emissions. And that is kind of the second level in the hierarchy in terms of priority. Then we have this kind of replacement aspect, and this is now where we are switching out equipment and machinery, substituting fuels, which are also very good endeavors and obviously important areas that will be required at some point, but maybe not necessarily the first action you can take, because even when you are kind of, moving from one type of production pathway to another, or different fuel sources, there comes additional emissions with that, especially in the upstream emissions towards the production and creation of this equipment and of these fuels that need to be factored in as well. So kind of overhauling and replacement is important, but should probably happen after taking a look at avoiding and reducing existing emissions based on your current facilities and operations. And after all that is done, then we kind of start to approach this compensation perspective and this removal perspective in terms of what we consider carbon offsets. This really should be the final step that you should pursue after you've exhausted all other avenues in terms of trying to reduce, and should certainly, as we talked about before, when pursuing this, a certain level of research and thoroughness needs to be considered and thought about in terms of, have we exhausted everything, and what and how should we compensate based on what plans and credits are available. And so a carbon offset is a mechanism to reduce GHG emissions by compensating for emissions elsewhere, as I talked about before, typically outside of the value chain, oftentimes in places like developing countries. The credit itself then is the transferable instrument. It is the transaction that happens after the project has been certified. And this is when you go online and you type in carbon credits and you make the purchase. This is the actual credit after validation, after verification. You can invest in your own projects and keep those credits after the validation and verification process and offset as you will. You can also sell those credits, but in that case, you cannot claim any type of offsets because someone else is going to claim them. And if it's not projects that you're pursuing, but simply the purchase and retirement of credits, that is another option that is available to you, and as you probably know. And there's different flavors of offsets as well. Removal from the atmosphere, sequestration, reductions, and also avoidance in some situations, although these are typically less common. So you can imagine a protected area that is at risk of being logged. We don't really have the data yet, but we know it's probably going to happen, and then kind of making that not happen to begin with. So that would be an example of kind of an avoidance, if you will, carbon project or carbon credit. And credibility is key when pursuing offsetting. So you should always ensure, and typically most of the big carbon offset providers do ensure this, that there is additionality that this project would not have existed had the voluntary carbon market not existed, that there was no type of government subsidies or something else, or other forces out there that would have caused these emission reductions to occur otherwise, that there's no leakage. So we're not simply removing one problem and transplanting the same problem to another country. Permanency, this is a little bit less well defined, but does the project demonstrate a specific duration of time that the emissions reductions will be intact and will not be sort of displaced? No double counting. This is probably the key one. And typically the registries prevent this from happening, but not allowing two entities to both claim and retire the credits at the same time. So then we have double booking. And is it measurable? And I think increasingly with nature-based solutions and looking at, for instance, with the increased focus on the ocean and absorption there of CO2, can we measure the data? And there is a strong focus on this, especially with nature-based solutions now and different land use change, in order to ensure that there are more or less standard methodologies and calculations out there that ensure that everyone is doing this more or less the same way. And we'll see more of that probably in the next year as the GHG protocol is developing kind of finally a standard that really tackles these types of land biogenic focused emissions that we're talking about here and that relate to offsetting. And increasingly, again, as I mentioned earlier, other parameters. Does the project require SDG alignments? Is biodiversity included? Are social benefits a part of the package? And understanding if these parameters are included and if they've been validated and verified as well is an important aspect that's required for projects, and to make sure that these things have taken place prior to making them available for purchase, if you will. So here is kind of just an example customer journey that you could experience with us. This would be more focused on verification as an example. But essentially upon engagement, what we do is we have an initial qualification period with you where we discuss your business needs, what you're trying to accomplish, get some type of alignment on that to make sure we're providing the right services, and then sign off on the agreements. And at this point, start providing you with the necessary tools, trainings, conversations to help you get going on your CFM journey. And then along with ongoing support, if that's an option, allowing you to ask us the questions, schedule sessions for feedback on what you're doing to ensure that you're progressing in the right way. And then taking feedback, of course, and making changes and tweaks to whatever it is that you're doing. And then finally, can we kind of move into the assessment piece now, where you provide us with your documentation, you're bringing it all together. We conduct the assessment or the audit. We issue a CFM report, let you know if you have been approved or not, and any nonconformities that need to be dealt with as well. And then following that, after successful completion, the move towards issuing the certificate and or labels if needed, and then continuing to improve as you move along through the journey. And again, if you need additional support there, even in later years, the program is built now to work with you as you continue to enhance the work that you're doing as it relates to CFM. One final slide. If you want more information regarding our CFM solution, you can find it under our website. Under the certification tab, there is an entry bookmarked carbon footprint services. And on that same page, there is an option, there is a portion of the form to populate your information and then submit it. And then a member of the climate team will get in contact you and schedule a follow-up conversation. So that concludes the body of the presentation. And I'll hand it over to you, Michael, now.
Yeah, and I'll quickly hand it over to you again, Justin. There are a couple of questions here. How do you begin to approach figuring out upstream suppliers' greenhouse gas emissions in relation to your business? We deal with in excess of 50 suppliers for paints, timber, metal inserts, upholstery, etc. So a good practical question, how do you get this done?
Well, yeah, I mean, 50, 100, 1,000, you can't tackle everything. And usually what we've seen is there's a couple of approaches. One of which is, and this depends on what you want to do, is how you want to tackle this as a business. One way is to look at revenue. We've seen companies do that. So look at products, for example, that bring in the most revenue to the business, and kind of create a hierarchy or ranking system there, and start focusing on the top 3 or 5 to begin with. Another way, as I mentioned earlier, is about material usage and the amount of material that's brought into the organization. So perhaps you have a ranking there and know that these are the top 5 materials, and you start thinking about how these relate to our specific products or services, and you can begin the conversation there. Another way is, I think, what I mentioned earlier. If you do have an existing materiality assessment within the organization or risk assessments in place, increasingly customers are kind of either going down that path to create such assessments or relying on existing data, for instance, to determine what are the products, as an example, that are of the highest risk moving forward. For instance, whether that be availability in the future, price changes, whatnot. So clients typically take different approaches to determine, where to begin first, and then this relates kind of to the supply chain as an example. Typically, you should begin with tier 1 suppliers, I would say. So maybe looking at tier 1 suppliers of only a portion of, for instance, those kind of key products could certainly help to kind of reduce the amount of suppliers that you may need to work with at the beginning. Second, oftentimes the expectation is to begin with tier 1 suppliers to begin with. Tier 2, tier 3, so on and so forth, usually are things that happen in later years of your CFM journey, not necessarily expected to go through all of that. And, like, for instance, a full LCA to begin with, if that's what you're thinking about. It's simply, unless you have an army of sustainability professionals behind you, it's probably not reasonable to think that you can do that. Another consideration too is, oftentimes the data that's available out there, especially in early years, can help you, can alleviate some of the work with working with tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, and the fact that oftentimes emission factors will create and have default data built into the emission values of a material or product that you're looking for already in it. Now, of course, it's not as precise as we would like, but it is a good step forward and kind of alleviates sort of this duress that comes with reaching out to suppliers. So essentially, you would work with your tier 1 suppliers, and then your tier 2, 3, tier 3, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. Can kind of be dealt with based on the existing average data that you can locate out there. And then as time goes on, of course, then you can start creating a plan to go further and deeper into the upstream supply chain.
I hope that clarified the question. We're very relevant to raise this. And there's another question. How do you distinguish between reducing and insetting? For example, investing in cleaner technology in own production supply chain.
I guess there isn't a significant. I mean, that's a good question. I think in a lot of ways they're very much similar. If you wanted to simply invest in an upstream supplier or partner and introduce clean energy as an example, that would be a great approach, and certainly something you could do and think about. I think insetting takes kind of an offsetting approach where it's not looking just at the reductions themselves, but it's also looking kind of at the full spectrum of the co-benefits and social aspects. So trying to ensure that if you make that investment, the livelihoods and ecosystems and so on and so forth at the point of that investment remain intact. I would say that's probably the key differentiator and could add a layer of credibility. But if you were to invest upstream without pursuing, for instance, the requirements or principles of insetting, that in itself could and would still be a reduction, at least for scope 3.
Okay, thanks, Justin. And then we have a question regarding FSC timber and whether that is classified as carbon neutral.
We need to do more work on the FSC, Michael.
Well, I can answer from in a life cycle analysis. Often you consider timber as being carbon neutral, right? But of course there are emissions in also a timber supply chain that is certified. So in some context, of course, those emissions are considered. But the assurance of a forest being intact and having a stable carbon stock is, of course, crucial, and FSC contributes to that. So it depends, I think, on the scope and in which context you are using FSC timber and doing your calculations.
Yeah, I think it's to that point. If you're involved with timber, FSC timber, whatever it might be, and you're an organization and you're doing cradle to gates, if we're saying that it's neutral, carbon neutral, that means that every step from inception, from extraction until the point where the product enters your gates, including your production facilities, all of those elements then have to be neutral. So I think it's a transparency aspect in understanding what's actually included. Maybe there's a situation where at the forestry level, at the extraction level, it is carbon neutral, but then is the transportation between suppliers carbon neutral? Are your production facilities, as you're transforming the material further, if need be, is that neutral? So if we're claiming neutrality, then all aspects need to be neutral one way or the other. And if they are neutral, is it because of reductions or is it because of offsetting as well? So I think it's a question of, are we talking about gate to gate? Are we talking about cradle to gate? Are we talking about cradle to grave? And depending on that, are all aspects being either reduced to zero or offset in such a way that you can make that claim, I think is what you need to consider.
Right. Thank you. We do also have some comments still regarding the credibility of offsetting and that actual reduction, and also considering biodiversity in offsetting projects and so on is critical. I think we touched upon that in the presentation. Of course, it's an area to be very much aware of, and I think we have also, as Justin said, considered in our standard, in our approach, that real reductions are the primary tool. Offsetting is a possible option, but there are requirements for offsetting projects as well, and they have to, of course, be credible, and that's a big discussion of when they are and how to ensure that. I think this ends the list of questions that I have here in the chatter. So I think we'll wrap it up here, and thank you very much for your participation and for raising very, very relevant and good questions. I hope this gave everybody an overview of the concept of carbon footprint management, the steps to implement this. It's a journey, of course, and there are some tools and services available from our side, and you're very welcome to reach out to us for further follow-up if you're interested through those links and emails, contacts that were in the presentation. We will be sending out the recording from this session here, and also some other material to everyone who signed up. And thank you very much for taking time today and participating.
I just figured I'd invite you just real quick.